My name is Will Hasty, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Sustainable Online Network for Global Cultural Studies, or SONGS initiative, to this evening's webinar, which forms part of the Spring 2022 webinar series titled Global Cultural Resource Analyses. Each of the events of this series really goes in its own different individual direction. Tonight, we go in the direction of Hong Kong martial arts. Hong Kong martial arts tradition. We were just chatting about this at the beginning. I would like to try to suggest here with a few broad strokes a global cultural context for tonight's webinar. This may or may not be applicable later on, but perhaps it's interesting as a starting point. I suspect it may be for some of my students. Martial arts narratives, understood in a broad sense, go back, of course, to the dawn of civilization and narrative proper. One thinks of the Mesopotamian Gilgamesh, one thinks of Homer's ancient Greek Iliad, moving to another part of the world and more in the direction of an actual treatise on the conduct of warfare. One thinks of the ancient Chinese general Sun Tzu's The Art of War. Everywhere, seemingly, where one looks in the ancient and medieval world, the martial is connected with arts, both of a narrative and also of a plastic and decorative type. Of course, one needn't look into the distant past at all, as I'm sure you all know very well, as the martial arts of the superheroes of DC and Marvel have been raking in capital in the billions over the past decades. It's difficult to imagine that these cinematic arts are not tapping into something that perhaps connects us to the audiences of those ancient heroic epics and of medieval chivalric romances. The connection of martial and arts also leads in another intriguing direction, and I think we might be getting a little bit sort of closer to what Professor Yip's going to be talking about tonight, and that is of different kinds of required training, methods of control or self-control, perhaps call it a code of conduct, both in Romance poetry and medieval European society. I talk about this because this is my own area of scholarly focus. For example, the idea began to emerge around the 12th century that warfare should properly only involve combatants. Increasingly, it was felt, even if it was never consistently practiced, that non-combatants needed to be off limits. This idea would be the germ of the Geneva Convention many, many centuries later. Martial arts, whether in a more purely entertainment or artistic way, or let's say having these more resonating cultural effects, is a topic that clearly has myriad interesting connections and resonances. And I think at this point, it's time to start getting a bit more specific. At this point, I was going to ask Steve Corey to introduce our speaker. We're still actually engaged in getting Steve connected, and I'm going to devote myself to that now, but I want to let Professor Yip get started with his presentation. Let me just first provide a brief introduction for Professor Fung Yip. He is chair and associate professor of film and media studies at the University of Oklahoma. He's author of Martial Arts Cinema and Hong Kong Modernity, Aesthetics, Representation and Circulation with HKU Press in 2017. He's co-editor of American and Chinese Language Cinemas Examining Cultural Flows, which was published with Routledge in 2015. Also of the Cold War and Asian cinemas, published with Routledge in 2019. His articles have been published in numerous edited volumes and in peer-reviewed journals such as Cinema Journal. His research and teaching interests focus on Chinese language and East Asian film studies, theories of national and transnational cinema, the juncture of cinema, mass culture and modernity, and the cinematic cultural Cold War. And with that, Professor Yip, I would like to turn things over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the nice introduction. And I also want to thank you, Professor Hasty, and the UF Songs Initiative, for hosting this event. And even though Stephen is not here, but I also want to thank him, for inviting me in the first place. It's my great honor, to be here to share my thoughts about Hong Kong martial arts cinema, with all of you. So with this, let me just share my screen. So hopefully, you can all see my screen. So as you can see, from the title of my presentation, today, I would like to focus, on the theme of training and its multiple meanings, within the Hong Kong martial art film genre. And I don't know how many of you have experience learning and practicing martial arts, but for those who do, you must know that how fundamental, how basic, training is, in martial arts philosophy and practice. The fact of the matter is, only those who train with patience and perseverance, who demonstrate, dedication and great effort, will become a true martial art. Will become a true master, in martial arts. So, considering, its significance in the world of martial arts, it is hardly surprising that training has been a major motif, right, in martial art films. This is especially true with two subgenres within the martial art cinema, the Shaolin Kung Fu films and Kung Fu comedies that gained popularity, in the mid and late 1970s. A good example here is Drunken Master from 1978, directed by Yuen Woo-ping, a film that first established, Jackie Chan as an action star. I'm going to show you a clip, and in that clip, we will see, the Jackie Chan character, go through one of, many arduous training routines designed by his strict, but also somewhat kind of, unorthodox master. So let me show the clip. Okay, so it's a short clip, but what catches our attention in the clip is in many ways, the sheer physical capacity, of Jackie Chan's performing body, right? The way in which, he performs, so the vertical sit-up. And we can call this, following Leon Han, corporeal authenticity. But yet, another form of authenticity, that is, cinematic authenticity, is also at stake here. So what I have in mind is the use of wide shots and long takes, in the clip, which serves to construct a quasi-documentary representation of the action without the use of kind of, a cinematic, artifice like editing, without the use of, quote unquote, cheating. In fact, cinematic and corporeal authenticity often go hand in hand with one another. In other words, the documentary impulse associated with the long take, long shot approach is what ensures the realism and authenticity of the physical training routine depicted in the film. So that's how the two forms of authenticity kind of interweave with one another, and both kind of adding to the authenticity of the on-screen performance. So it is clear that a key idea in all of this is authenticity, which I should mention has been a major discourse surrounding the martial art film genre. So for example, when we watch a martial art film, we tend to expect to see quote unquote real kung fu. That is, the depiction of action that showcase, the awesome physical capacity, of the actors, and minimizes quote unquote cheating associated with editing, or other uses of cinematic artifice. What we see in Drunken Master and many other martial art films of the period is that the preoccupation with authenticity has extended to the training sequences, which increasingly require a level of corporeal prowess equal to, if not more than, that in the fight scenes. In other words, the vertical sit-up, that we see, in the clip is no less difficult, right, than, all the kind of, fight sequences, that we also see, in the other parts, of the film. But yet there's another way to conceive of the relationship between training and authenticity. One that focuses, not on the on-screen performance, that is, the on-screen training sequences, but rather on the training of the action stars in real life. Specifically, the ways in which actors or actresses, are given an aura of legitimacy and authenticity, through the arduous training that enables them to perform difficult and often dangerous stunts themselves, rather than relying on doubles. So it is in this sense that we can make sense of the many well-known stories that have been told by different people and in various media outlets about how Jackie Chan received, hellish training as a child in the well-known, China Drama Academy. So as you can see, so the picture on the right, is Jackie Chan, right, with his master Yu Jianyuan, and then the picture on the left, right, is the so-called seven fortunes, right, and Jackie Chan is one of them. But of course, the seven fortunes, also include, other famous, martial arts or action stars like, Sammo Hung or, Yuen Biao. So again, all of them kind of, trained with, Yu Jianyuan, as a child. And of course, Yu is famous, for his very strict and difficult training. So again, we see a lot of stories being repeated about how Jackie Chan, right, went through this kind of tough and hellish training as a child. In fact, there's even a film, right, that is about this their experiences, right, within the China Drama Academy. So, but it's important to note that all these stories are by no means mere recollections of the good old days, right? But rather they serve the function of validating and legitimizing the star while adding to the perception of authenticity, in their performance, and star images. So the same off-screen focus, can also be observed, right, in connection with, other action stars. For instance, as part of its marketing campaign, for the film Hapkido, the film company, Golden Harvest, ran an article in its official magazine, Golden Movie News, in which, Angela Mao, who was one of the most prominent female action stars in the 70s. So in this article, well, I'm not sure how many of you can actually read Chinese, right? But I know if you pay close attention to it, Angela Mao kind of, recollect, right, in detail her time of training with a Hapkido master in South Korea. So again, all this was in preparation, right, for the film Hapkido itself. And in the article, Angela Mao mentioned that the training was tough and demanding. But the fact that she managed to overcome all the obstacles and pass the first done examination in the end made her very proud of herself. So of course, we don't know how true, right, of this is, right? I would think that she did train with the Hapkido master, right? But again, whether she passed the examination or not, right, is anyone's guess, right? But that's not really important, right? Because what's really important is the fact that this is a kind of a perplexity material that serves to validate and authenticate the star herself. And likewise, Wang Yu, another kind of action star of the period, right? And of course, he stars in the famous One-Armed Swordsman film from 1967. So here again, another article, from Golden Movie News emphasized, the coaching of Wang Yu by a top Japanese karate master, and again, that's in preparation of the star's upcoming film, Seaman #7. And another example here is, this is about, Jen Pei. Jen Pei again is known for her role as Golden Swallow in Come Drink with Me, and she also appears right in An Lee's Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. But again, this is an article that talks about how Jen Pei trains her skills right in preparation for her role in Whiplash. So again, we have many other examples. But obviously, the most intense media and public interest, in the real life training of action stars, pertains, to Bruce Lee. As a sign of the widespread fascination with these elaborate training methods, there were, tons of media reports, anecdotes, both before and after his death, about the star's rigorous workout routines, as well as his specially designed diet and even his alleged use of performance-enhancing drugs. And here in this particular article, you can see the different kind of equipment, right, that Lee used, right, in training his body, right, including the wooden dummy, but also more kind of modern and technological kind of equipment. So there's no denying that Lee devoted a lot of effort, right, to train himself into a consummate martial artist. However, the copious attention given to his training regime takes on broader meanings in the context of our discussion here. In many ways, this kind of perplexity materials form part of an authenticity boosting discourse that shape and continue to shape the mythology of the action star. So now I would like to move on to the second dimension of training in Hong Kong martial art films, right? And that pertains to the idea of succession. And it is true that one may train to become an accomplished fighter without the assistance of others, without the assistance of teachers or masters. But martial arts training often entails a pedagogical experience involving the transmission of fighting skills and or martial virtues from the master to the disciple. So this aspect of training as succession is most thoroughly illustrated in the films of Lau Ka-leung, especially his 1976 film, Challenge of the Masters. So in this film, Gordon Liu, the guy on the right-hand side, and by the way, some of you might know him for his portrayal, right, for his appearance, right, in Quarantino Kill Bill series. So in this film, Gordon Liu plays the role of Wang Fei-hung, the famous Cantonese folk hero and the protagonist of many prior movies, notably the long-running series featuring Kwon Taek-hin from 1949 up to the first half of the 1970s. And we are talking about literally tens. I think there are at least 80, if not 90, right, films within the series. So again, Wang Fei-hung is this famous kind of a folk hero that a lot of people know about him. But instead of the authoritative, patriarchal figure, right, depicted, in that long-lasting series, the character is presented, in this film as a talented, but unruly kind of, kid, right, who dismissed by his father as too reckless and immature, is barred from learning martial arts, and thus from assuming his place, in the family's martial arts lineage. It is only through the effort of a family friend, Yun Cheng, that Wang is taken in as a disciple by Lu Tai, who turns out to be the teachers of Wang's own father, right? So I think this is so interesting that, the same master actually teaches both the father and the son. And after years of strenuous training, during which time Yun, the family friend, is killed by a criminal played by director Lau Ka-leung himself, Wang succeeds at least, in transforming himself and returns home to face off, with the criminal, and leads his family martial arts school to victory, in the annual firecracker contest. Right. So this is a brief synopsis of the film. But what's important to note is that in many ways, Challenge of the Master stands as a tribute to the pedagogical process lying at the core of the formation of a martial artist. So like many martial art movies of the period, the film weaves the process of training into the very heart of its narrative. For instance, there are several lengthy sequences in which the young Wang Fei Hong cultivates, his fighting skills, right? As we can see, here. So, for example, strengthening the legs through stance practices, circling a pole around bowls of increasing size, but also sparring with a wooden dummy. So through these, tough training exercises, the hero successfully transformed himself from a kung fu novice to a martial arts expert, worthy of his master's name. Thus, we can, it's true that we can find such detailed exposition of the training process in other films. But Lau Ka-leung here added an extra dimension by highlighting the significance of the master figure. So again, as you can see from all these images, right, the master, right, has the same presence, right? Is equally important, right, in terms of the composition, right, as the student himself, right? So again, is a collaborative process, right? It's a pedagogical process, right? Rather than someone who tries to improve himself, right, on his own. So for Lau Ka-leung, training is not simply a self-propelling quest for power and mastery. Instead, it is a collaborative process, that requires the active participation from the master. So in charge of the master, Lu Tai is given precisely such an active role, coaching and initiating the student into mastery through beatings, demonstrations, and examples, as well as the same exhaustive training drills that have formed the master himself. So by the end, the master and the student have become a single unit brought together by a shared martial arts heritage, the unity beautifully captured by the synchronization of movements and rhythms during the final sparring practices. And I'm going to show you a little bit of this final part. Okay, so it is clear that by the end of the training process, the student has become the equal, right, to the master, uh, and again, I mean, we can clearly see their kind of the unity, right, their kind of achieve, I mean, being at the same level, uh, by kind of this kind of synchronization of movements, but also by this the similar appearance, right, that both take on, right, by the end of the sequence. And again, it's interesting that in in this in martial arts training, right, especially as a pedagogical process, right, there's always this idea that the student try to imitate, right, the master, right, and becomes like him, right. Not only acquiring the skills, but also kind of in a way look like him, and forming a certain kind of unity, right. And that of course becomes the whole kind of martial arts lineage, and or the kind of the legacy, right, that is being transmitted, right, from one person to another, right, and and through different generations. And also, it is important that the master exists not only as a physical trainer, but also as someone committed to the moral development of the student, the moral development of the student. In other words, it is not merely a fighting skills, but the code of martial chivalry, particularly the virtues of humility, self-control, forgiveness, and non-violence that are being taught and passed on. Interestingly, the final words of Lu Chai as he bids farewell to transform Wang Fei Hong is more forgiveness, less aggression. And it is precisely these same words that flash by in the student's mind after the latter has defeated the criminal who killed the family friend and is about to launch the fatal strike. So again, as you can see, in the image below, right, it's the same words, right, that flash in the mind of Wang Fei Hong as he is about to kill, right, and take revenge, right, on the criminal. So in the end, he refrains from killing, the criminal, and even tries to help his wounded opponent stand, even though the latter tries desperately, to fight him again. So the contrast of this Wang Fei Hong are poised, controlled, thoughtful, and authoritative in an understated way, with his earlier self cannot be greater. It is clear that the once headstrong and unruly lad has totally refashioned himself, learning from his master that winning the heart of one's rival is ultimately more important than physically conquering him. So as is clear from the previous analysis, training as a pedagogical process involving both the master and the disciple is what allows Wang Fei Hong to assume his place in the family's martial arts lineage, thus ensuring its uninterrupted continuation or sustainability, if I can make a passing reference to the theme of the Song's initiative this year. For Lau Ka Leung, the director of Challenge of the Masters, this notion of passing on a tradition is personally significant. For he himself is part of the martial art lineage in question, which is a long and venerated one that can be traced to the legendary Shaolin Temple. Specifically, as a home-based practitioner, Lau's martial arts genealogy goes back to Sun De, Shaolin monk, and descends from Hong Se Guan, Lu Chai. So Lu Chai is the master figure, right, in Challenge of the Masters. And then Huang Qiying is, of course, the father of Wang Fei Hong. So, and then on to Wang Fei Hong, and then Lin Xirong, and then to Lao Zhang. Lao Zhang is the father of Lau Ka Leung, right? So again, and then to Lau Ka Leung. So as you can see, Lau Ka Leung himself, right, is part of this, martial arts lineage or genealogy. And what is even more interesting is that Lau Ka Fai, or AKA, Gordon Liu, right, who stars, in Challenge of the Master, he's a half brother of Lau Ka Leung, and he actually learns martial arts, from Lau Ka Leung himself, right? So in this sense, Lau Ka-Fai himself, right, is part of, this martial arts, lineage. So both on screen and off screen, right, this idea of a succession, right, this idea of, the master-disciple relationship is important. And of course, it is in many ways because of this kind of, extra-textual kind of, reference, right, that in a way, impels, right, Lau Ka Learn to depict, right, this martial art lineage, in his films. So this claim to Shaolin heritage, has given Lau Ka Learn a degree of authority unparalleled in Hong Kong martial arts cinema, which in turn bestows a stamp of authenticity, to the training sequences, in his films. But as we have seen, our Church of the Masters is not just about the training regime per se. More importantly, it foregrounds and celebrates, the process of a succession, and thus the continuation and sustainability of a tradition, which is actually his through a chain of master-disciple relationships. Now, I would like to move to the third and last part of my presentation, which focuses on the idea of training as self-actualization. While many Hong Kong martial art films, as we have seen, frames the training process as a pedagogical experience involving the master and the disciple, other films feature self-propelling heroes who subject themselves to grueling training routines and perfect their martial art skills with little help from the masters, if they exist at all. Such an individualistic conception of training actually is quite common in Hollywood films. Consider, for instance, Rocky, the Rocky series, and also, Ridley Scott's, G.I. Jane. So in both films, the protagonists, tend to be self-impelling agents, right? The teachers, serving primarily as motivators, or facilitators. In the Hong Kong context, the most compelling example of this trend is arguably, the 36th Chamber of Shaolin, directed again by Lau Ka Learn and starring again, Gordon Liu. Set in the early Qing era, the film recounts the story of Liu Yude, played by Gordon Liu, who begins as an upright but naive student drawn by his activist teacher to a local revolt against the Manchu government, and ends up being a consummate Kung Fu expert after years of tough training in the Shaolin Temple. Narrative-wise, the film may be broadly divided into three parts. The first part deals with the failed mutiny and the ensuing manhunt that forces the young rebel to flee to the Shaolin Temple. Whereas the third and last part depicts how the protagonist now transformed and renamed as Sander. But again, recall that Sander is actually the origin of the martial arts lineage of Lau Ka Learn himself, right? So now transformed and renamed as Sander, accepts revenge on the Manchu officials and establishes the 36th Chamber of Shaolin dedicated to teaching martial arts to laymen. So again, all this constitutes the origin of Lau Ka Learn's martial arts lineage. So in any case, despite some exciting set pieces in the first and last parts, the main attraction of the film lies in the extended training sequences that make up the majority of the film's middle act. So in a series of ingeniously staged scenes, the viewer is shown the process in which Sander undergoes various regimes of harsh body and mind conditioning. So at the outset, the training is focused on specific parts or skills of the body, as when walking across floating logs improve one's balance and agility, or carrying pails of water uphill builds the upper body strength, and banging a giant metal bell with a heavy weight attached to a long slender bamboo rod strengthen the strength of the wrist. And other training exercises, include, focusing the eyes on moving points of light for sharpness and concentration of sight, and banging the head against sandbags, to enhance, its power. So it is only after these basics have been mastered is the student able to move on to actual weapon training or actual kind of, combat training. So what I want to point out here is that while the senior Shaolin monks are always there during the training process, they primarily take the role of a passive observer, letting the student do his drills without overt interventions. In some cases, the student would receive words of wisdom from a monk that help him overcome the challenge and move on to the next stage. But it is ultimately the student's own grit, resilience, and hard work, that are given emphasis. The rapport between the master and the disciple, evident in many martial art films, is definitely given shrift here. So in foregrounding training as a self-propelling quest for mastery, the 36th Chamber of Shaolin brings out forcefully the close affinity of martial arts training with a cluster of ideas, including individualistic labor and hard work, a capacity to persevere, a will to prevail and succeed, centrally associated with the ascetic ethic and the capitalist ideology of work that it helps define. And by the term ascetic, I do not simply mean a morality of renunciation, but take it in a more, in a broader sense, as an active act of acquiring power through submission to a regime of exercise and discipline. Such a conception, which is already contained in the Greek word from which the term ascetic is derived, provides us with a way to conceptualize how the training motif in martial art films served and continue to serve as an ideological template for the capitalist subjects, in Hong Kong. That there's an underlying connection between ascetic modes of self-empowerment and the spirit of capitalism is by no means a new idea, right? Definitely, I did not kind of, invent it myself. It has been proposed by, people like, Max Weber, notably, in his book, The Protestant Ethic, and the Spirit of Capitalism. So according to Weber, the development of capitalism in the West was intimately linked to the emergence of a unique type of self, one with a particular mode of power inclined towards rationalized labor characteristic of capitalist society. And this power is seen as rooted in the Puritan concept of the calling, which endowed Protestant entrepreneurs with an ascetic ethic that manifested itself, among other things, in a determined effort to discipline the natural self and subject it to a new and higher self devoted to the pursuit of wealth and material successes, as signs of divine grace. So it is my contention that, an ascetic ethic also provided a powerful force for the breeding of capitalist individuals, in post-war Hong Kong, and gave them an amazing capacity to endure and overcome adversity. But this asceticism, unlike the one discussed by Weber, had little to do with the Protestant ethic. Rather, it was linked to the social political conditions of Hong Kong during the post-war period, when newly arrived Chinese refugees, faced with the uncertainties of living in a borrowed place and time, and with the lack of an adequate social safety net in a colonial society, took advantage of a fast-growing industrial sector and a relatively open opportunity structure to move up in the social hierarchy. This meant, however, that the most effective avenue for upward mobility resided in the economic realm, and that one could not depend on anything but his or her own effort in order to achieve success. All this provided the conditions for the emergence of a capitalist ascetic ethic that legitimated economic success as an ultimate purpose to which all energies should be devoted, while fostering at the same time a mode of power best epitomized by the do or die work ethic that kept one working for days and nights without rest. Well, its potential downside, for example, labor exploitation notwithstanding, this aesthetic ethic has come to be seen as a major driving force for Hong Kong's post-war economic takeoff. We can clearly see the concept and its ideological ramifications articulated in the 36th Chamber of Shaolin, with its self-propelling protagonist achieving mastery over oneself and over the world by means of a series of grueling training, what can be called ascetic practices of the self. Another way to conceive this morality of asceticism, capitalist asceticism, to be more exact, in the film is through what Viggo Morris calls the power of banality. The way in which, I quote, practice, repetition, training, the dull gestures of an everyday reality intimately form the martial artist and bring wonder into the world. This concept of banal power is embedded in the 36th Chamber of Shaolin on at least two levels. On the one hand, it is not by coincidence that the training process depicted in the film focuses not on some fancy fighting styles, at least not in the beginning, but rather on such fundamentals as balance, strength, and resilience, all of which are related to the basic capacities of the body. Underlying this focus is a simple but essential idea. The path to success, whether in Kung Fu learning or in other endeavors, is grounded precisely in such basic aptitudes. And in order to master them, one needs to go through some ordinary and often monotonous, but ultimately rewarding training practices. On the other hand, and this is related to the first point, it is worth noting how frequently the training depicted in the film evokes the banal experience of ordinary blue-collar workers. The emphasis on the body is a case in point, which conjures up the physical work nature of the film's working class audiences. And of course, the affinities can be even more direct. Right? A case in point involves the scene in which Sandra is shown carrying pails of water uphill, right, as we see in the image above. And this is a routine that clearly alludes to the chores of many manual laborers, right? So again, as you can see, in the image on the right, right? So again, in a way, it's very similar. And this link between Kung Fu training and everyday work becomes even more overt in a later film of Lau Ka Leung, Return to the 36th Chamber. Not so much a sequel, but a reworking of the ideas of Kung Fu pedagogy, ascetic training, and empowerment of the self explored in the earlier film. Return to the 36th Chamber is even more direct in its allusions to the laboring class and its everyday work experience. Probably I don't have time to discuss the film in detail here. I think it suffices for me to say here that the Shaolin Temple, again, is used as a key setting. And we can see another series of inspired sequences on martial arts training, which turns out to take the form of work. What I mean here is that instead of going through the conventional training processes, the protagonist is ordered by the senior monk to scaffold the entire Shaolin Temple, nominally for its regularly scheduled renovation, but actually as a means to train and discipline the student. Reluctant but obedient, the main character gets to work every day, but is constantly sidetracked by the martial arts training going on in the courtyard, of which he has a good view from his high vantage point. He starts inventing his own training drills modeled on what he sees, using the resources of his work to improvise training facilities. So in one case, he puts up a wooden dummy by using the bamboo poles intended for scaffolding the temple. In another instance, he emulates the leg strengthening exercise by forcing himself to work with his feet tied to the bamboo scaffold. The key point here, however, is that the protagonist himself is completely unaware of the training he is going through. It is only after leaving the Shaolin Temple and fighting off some thugs in town that he finally realizes, his newly acquired martial arts skill. So in this sense, what we see in Return of the 36th Chamber is banal power at its most potent. Ascetic training as a means to self-empowerment and mastery of the world is shown to be so embedded in mundane work experience that it becomes an unconscious process. Another way to put this is that labor, especially physical labor, constitutes a kind of covert training and thus a source of power and self-actualization. So this process of self-empowerment achieved through ascetic training routines evoking physical labor is not just a matter of building up endurance or perseverance. More important is a capacity to compete, to overcome barriers and obstacles in the way to success through the transformed body. As such, it offered the audiences of the film, many of whom were manual workers directly involved in Hong Kong's labor-intensive industrialization and toiling their bodies to improve their socio-economic standing, a fantasy of rising above their disciplined bodies at work, and brought a sense of vindication to their hardships and sacrifices. But the key term here is perhaps fantasy, because it is important to point out that the idea of self-empowerment through ascetic training found in the 36th Chamber of Shaolin series can be said to constitute a regulatory mechanism that is anything but liberating. One can get a better understanding of what is at stake here through the notion of technologies of the self proposed by Michel Foucault. So moving away from his earlier focus on the social disciplining mechanisms to which the body is subjected in modern life, Foucault suggests in some of his later works that the power imposed on the body is not simply about social forms of regulation and control, but has to do with methods and techniques through which individuals constitute themselves in an active fashion. Such practices of the self, however, do not necessarily signify a form of liberation because they are not something, and I quote, they are not something that the individual invents by himself, but rather patterns which are proposed, suggested, and imposed on him by his culture, his society, and his social group. As an example of such imposed practices of self-fashioning, the ascetic attainment of power, whether manifested on screen, that is Kung Fu training, or in everyday life, that is manual labor, derives from and contributed to the capitalist ethic underpinning Hong Kong's industrial modernity. It can thus be conceived not as a process of liberation, but one of subjection. This process of subjection, I hasten to add, did not work by producing docile bodies. Rather, its regulatory effects resided in creating new perceptions and experiences about the capacities of the body, thereby refreshing the individual not simply as empowered subjects, but as empowered workers ready for selling their bodies as labor. So again, just to make a very brief conclusion, training is a major motif in Hong Kong martial arts and action cinema. And it can most clearly be seen in the Shaolin Kung Fu movies and Kung Fu comedies in the second half of the 1970s. But it has continued to play a key role in more recent films. For example, No Retreat, No Surrender from 1986, Dreams of Glory, a boxer story from 1991, and most recently, Unbeatable, from 2013. So far from being an outmoded idea, training has remained an important motif that provides a vital horizon for Hong Kong martial art and action films, and for our understanding of them. So I guess this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Dr. Yip. I am very sorry for showing up a little bit late. I had a little bit of trouble signing in. So hopefully Matt Felt, my colleague, will not be signing in tonight because I signed in using his credential, which got me in. So anyways, again, thank you so much for the talk. And my first reaction, as I think I've showed you earlier, is simply "hao gongfu." You're welcome. So I know that we maybe didn't have an opportunity to introduce you, Dr. Yip, but I will make sure that I introduce you to my course. I see that most of the people that are here tonight are actually students from our martial arts course. So I'm really sorry for not having time to sort of properly and formally introduce you. I will just say that Dr. Yip is an associate professor at the University of Oklahoma and also chair of the Department of Film and Media Studies. And I had some other things, but again, I'll fill that in a little bit later. I found the trends toward authenticity and self-actualization and the reaffirmation of succession or maybe transmission that you carefully described in your talk tonight, both very convincing and very enlightening. And for any, well, I think most of the crowd here is from our Quest East Asia Martial Arts Classics course. And I will just say that the talk is really perfectly timed for the wuxia to gongfu transition that we're just getting into in class right now. The special link that Dr. Yip highlighted between martial arts training, the Shaolin Temple, and 1970s films on Shaolin really does get to the heart of real, authentic Kung Fu. And it's interesting that training is not as nearly as well represented in the more fantasy-like wuxia or martial gallant genre of martial arts films. And Lau Kar-Long's 1978 36 Chamber of Shaolin is a great example of training, not only because it features one of the most famous centers of martial arts training, the Shaolin Temple in northern Henan, and is clearly a martial arts film, but also because of the grueling training that you mentioned that the film's star, Gordon Liu, was subjected to under his teacher and director, Lau Kar-Long. The notion of off-screen background reputation impacting the success of a film is also very interesting. Not only is the Gordon Liu example pertinent, but also Bruce Lee, who, as Dr. Yip pointed out, is really well known for his training, even though his films tend to very rarely portray that training. Even more pertinent is the example of the three dragons, Jackie Chan, Sammo Hung, and Yuan Biao, a little bit later than the period you were focused on tonight, who were downright abused by their teacher at the Hong Kong academy they studied in, and would later gravitate toward this sort of badly behaving Xiaozi or mischievous lad motif in a very authentic and personal way. And I don't know much about Jet Li's training with Wu Bin in the late 1970s, but I know from friends his reputation as the Wushu champion of China, and it certainly helped me enjoy his films. All the excellent examples provided by Dr. Yip forced me to just mention that sustainability is closely bound up with this link to authenticity. There are real martial arts in China, and the Kung Fu genre seems to plug into this realness better than other types of martial arts films like the wuxia, or even more supernatural fantasy films, making the ongoing production of these films sustainable. This sustainability is bolstered by both a willingness to engage in and preserve traditions like the master-disciple succession that you highlighted, and a willingness to explore more modern terrains and themes, which you also mentioned. Because the Kung Fu genre can be set up in the present time, it can cover just about any walk of life, it's inherently open to a wider audience, both inside and outside of Hong Kong and China, than, for example, wuxia films. Succession or master to disciple transmission is ubiquitous in Chinese culture, and it's an important element in both Chinese martial arts and Hong Kong cinema. Dr. Yip also referred to other things that make the backstory to Lau's 1978 36 Chamber of Shaolin so interesting. As you know, he went through the sort of transmission, the lineage very, very carefully. Lau was the son of a martial arts master who studied the Hong Fist style, which originated from or can be traced back to the Southern Shaolin Tiger style. I could skip over some of this. And again, his father, you know, by way of another master, was a student of Huang Feihong, the famous 19th and early 20th century martial arts master. and folk hero from Foshan, whose life has been fictionalized in a number of different films. The ones that I'm most familiar with are the Once Upon a Time in China series starring Jet Li, but that's not here nor there. Let's see. Lau Kar-wai also put in his time, as they say, as an action choreographer in many of Zhang Che's films before he himself became a director. And it wasn't a very smooth succession, but I'll leave it at that. And many of his relatives, brothers, nephews are involved in the business as directors, actors, or choreographers. Thus, family and master-disciple succession and transmission played important roles in Lau's martial arts and filmmaking training. And far from being exceptional, similar ties are apparent in most of the late 1970s, 80s, and even into the 1980s Hong Kong martial arts films, even some later, as you mentioned at the end of your talk. However, Dr. Yip also added in part of his original paper that he didn't have time to cover tonight, but I heard him mention at the very end of his talk, that 1970s Hong Kong martial arts comedies portray a more cynical view of this master-disciple relationship. And these sometimes very subversive takes can be traced back much earlier, but they're especially well represented in Hong Kong martial arts comedies. In Yuan Wuoping's 1978 Snake and the Eagle's Shadow, Jackie Chan plays an orphan adopted into a kung fu school where he's abused and beaten up by the teachers and students regularly until he turns to a beggar who teaches him snake-style kung fu. And as Dr. Yip points out, Sammo Hung's, I don't know, I missed the beginning of the talk, so I don't know if you got to this, Dr. Yip, but Sammo Hung's 1979 Knockabout features two con brothers who try to scam a man, get beat up by him, and then try to become his disciples so they can learn all of his skills and actually take his place, right? This is not the traditional master-disciple succession that we're talking about here. A common feature in Hong Kong in Kung Fu comedies, this overturning of the master-disciple relationship also acquires even more cynical meanings as it evolves. And I wonder about the psychology of a lot of this, especially in the case of Jackie Chan, Sammo Hung, and Yuan Biao, who were trained by the very demanding master Yu Zhanyuan, and who are responsible for much of the late 70s and 80s Kung Fu comedy boom in Hong Kong. Self-actualization also plays an important role in each of their journeys. Dr. Yip drew our attention to the fact that while many Hong Kong martial artist films emphasize traditional master-disciple transmission and succession, others stress self-discovery, self-attainment, or self-actualization without the help of a patron, teacher, or master. Dr. Yip contends that an aesthetic ethic provided a powerful force for the breeding of capitalist individuals in post-war Hong Kong and gave them an amazing capacity to endure and overcome adversity. He cogently draws from the work of Max Weber to defend this view, arguing that it was not any sort of explicitly Protestant ethic that propelled colonial Hong Kong, but a unique political and economic situation that fostered a do-or-die work ethic on all levels of society, high and low. Films mirrored this situation in new, interesting, and empowering ways. They increasingly drew links between Kung Fu training and everyday work, and masters were not always needed to train oneself in a skill or a set of skills. Dr. Yip provided us with several great examples from works like Lau Kar-long's 1980 Return to the 36th Chamber and Sammo Hung's Knockabout. Where there's a long tradition of solitary cave training in wuxia films, often with the aid of a text or a divine teacher, authentic or real are not really the operative terms there. I wonder, however, if we can already claim, not very happily, that this trend away from tradition toward a more experimental and subversive way of portraying Chinese martial arts was only as sustainable as Hong Kong was sustainable. And that sustainability may have ended very recently, but that's something that I'd love to hear your take on, Dr. Yip. On a more positive note, one could perhaps further expand the discussion on training in Hong Kong martial arts cinema by focusing even more, I mean, I know you did a lot, but even more on the filmmakers themselves. I found Dr. Yip's discussion of an ascetic ethic, in 1960s and 70s Hong Kong both convincing and intriguing. The notion of Gong Fu as effort needed to complete a task or abilities and skills developed through effort and time. Even ideas implicit in the term like drill, practice, toil, they seem just as, if not more prevalent in the creative process as in the final product. In other words, the making of wuxia or gongfu films, particularly in Hong Kong during the late 1960s and 70s, when the Shaw Brothers and Golden Harvest were pumping out film after film at breakneck speed and simultaneously perfecting their cinematic gongfu, all in that do or die spirit that Dr. Yip mentioned, is a perfect example of this ascetic ethic in practice. Succession, transmission, and self-actualization played significant roles in the Hong Kong film industry of the late 1960s and 70s and 80s. And once again, sustainability is woven into the industry through tradition, but subjected to different trajectories when much of the industry is infused with mainland Chinese money in the 1990s, suffers through the Asian financial crisis, SARS, rampant piracy, and the rise of the mainland film industry. There have been bright spots, as Dr. Yip mentioned, since the millennium began, but I don't think it's a stretch to claim that the heyday of Hong Kong as a world leader of film production has passed, or maybe it hasn't. I don't know. This is something that I'd like to hear Professor Yip respond to. So I'll let Fung respond before taking questions from the crowd.
Okay, thank you so much, for this, insightful and illuminating response. Well, first off, right, I guess I have to agree with you that, I mean, I hate to say this, right, but I have to agree with you that, the heyday of Hong Kong is something of the past, for all kinds of reasons, right? But obviously, the shifting kind of market focus right now to the mainland market, right? I think it has a lot to do with, the general kind of decline, right, in what I perceive as Hong Kong cinema, right? Because I do think that for a long time, Hong Kong films are very different from the films made in mainland China, and in fact Hong Kong films are very different from from all other films made across the globe, right? It's this identity, right? It's this kind of distinctiveness, that that really kind of characterize Hong Kong cinema, for me, right? And of course, martial art films, and action films, are one of the more kind of prominent examples, right, of this style. Yeah, I mean there are still kind of a few bright spots. Especially during the first decade of the 21st century, right? So think of Shaolin soccer, or a Kung Fu Hustle, right? Those are really kind of films that on the one hand kind of look back to the Hong Kong tradition, but also at the same time kind of look forward, right, to the theologically kind of altered kind of action cinema, right? Very much in the Hollywood kind of blockbuster style. And of course, there's also Wong Kar-wai's the Grandmaster, right? So that's more kind of the art cinema mode of martial art film, right? But it really kind of does a very good job in tracing the whole idea of succession, right? And seeing Hong Kong as the true kind of destination of Chinese kind of cultural lineage, at least in terms of martial arts, right? Because as we know, martial arts and martial art films in particular kind of had been banned, right, in mainland China for a long time, right, after the communist takeover in 1949, right? So a lot of filmmakers, right, a lot of the kind of the martial artists actually kind of fled to Hong Kong, right, and set up a base there, right, and from there, right, they develop, right, this very distinct kind of local Hong Kong tradition. So in many ways, in the Grandmaster, we see this kind of alternative notion of how Chinese martial arts tradition kind of were transmitted, right, from the mainland, right, to Hong Kong, right? So again, Hong Kong serving as this kind of destination for Hong Kong of Chinese martial arts culture. But yeah, apart from Yes, I mean, again, I have to agree with you that, Hong Kong cinema was a kind of a pale shadow, right, of its past, right? Um,
Yeah,
other,
thanks so much.
other people may not agree with, this assessment, but, but obviously, there's still very interesting things, going on in Hong Kong cinema, right? But it's just that, it's not as kind of, globally kind of, prominent, right, as it was, before.
I'm just going to leave this as a comment, but thank you so much for the response. I also wonder how much like the group that was in Hong Kong is now kind of diffuse in mainland. Like how much of that tradition is sort of informing what is happening more in mainland cinema. But I'm going to leave that because we got to get to some questions.
Oh, one thing one final thing I want to say is,
Sure.
I mean, just think of Jackie Chan, right? Again, Jackie Chan used to be seen as the representative, right, of Hong Kong action cinema, right? And his name is synonymous with kind of Hong Kong action films, right? But now what is he saying, right? He essentially is saying that there's no more Hong Kong cinema, right? Hong Kong cinema does not exist, right? There's only one cinema, and that is Chinese cinema.
Interesting.
I guess that says it all, right?
Yeah. So students out there, I know that you're dying to ask some questions. So if you would like to chime in, you can even use the chat function if you would like to submit a question via chat. And it looks like we have one, Dr. Yip. So my name is Viz. I enjoyed your talk. My question is, what are the main differences between Kung Fu and martial arts in training?
The main differences between Kung Fu and martial arts in training. I don't know if, I get the, so is it about Kung Fu and martial arts, the difference between Kung Fu and martial arts, in training? Well, again, in within martial arts cinema, Kung Fu is a special term, right, that refers, to a specific subgenre, right, that is, distinguishable from wuxia or, just martial arts. So I guess, in English, right, we kind of, distinguish, between martial art films and Kung Fu films in general, right? And of course, sometimes we use wuxia, right, to stand for martial art films. But martial art films, can also be used as a kind of umbrella term, right, that comprise both wuxia and Kung Fu. So the terminology, is a little bit confusing. But if you're asking about the distinction between Kung Fu and wuxia, then the main difference is wuxia typically is set in the past, right, ancient past or mythical past, right, and it's more fantasy oriented, and it often involves armed combat, right, so weapon fighting. Kung Fu films tend to be set in more recent past, and it involves mostly unarmed combat, right? In other words, fist fighting. Okay, and that in and the fact that the kind of the temporal difference, right? Kung Fu films being set in more recent past, right? Whereas wuxia films tend to have this kind of mythical connotations. I think that's one of the reasons that explains why training is not as prominent in wuxia film as in Kung Fu films, right? Because again, in Kung Fu films, it's all about the body. It's all about the physical capacity of the body, right? And that involves strength, that involves balance, agility, and things like that, right? And all of this requires training. So I guess that's I think this is one of the reasons why training is given much more emphasis, right, in Kung Fu films than in wuxia films.
Okay, and just so everybody knows, if you want to use the raise hand function down in reactions, you're welcome to do that as well. But we do have another question from Mason. Do you think that the wuxia style of film with the special effects and CGI, for example, for example, the characters flying during battle takes away from the dedication and training it takes for the martial artists and other depictions of martial arts? And I mean, in a sense, this question kind of gets to the heart of that distinction, but Dr.
Yeah. Well, I guess first I would like to mention that, even with Well, it depends, what kind of technology we are talking about, right? Because before, the advance of CGIs, and digital technologies, a lot of martial art films, uses, for example, something like wire work, right? That's considered as a form of technology, right? But at the same time, I would like to point out that even with wire work, it still requires a lot of physical kind of prowess, right? It still requires training, right? But it's true that with the transition to CGI, and digital effects, yes, I mean it does take away from the dedication, from the need to train one's body, right? In part because when you see I don't know, I mean when you see, for example, let me use a kind of West, a US example, right? Because that is probably more kind of relevant to you, right? So when you see somebody like Tom Cruise, right? Who kind of perform all those kind of amazing kind of physical feats, right? And that he there's no way he can do it, right? And it's all about special effects, it's all about CGIs. Then yes, I mean you start to kind of question, right? Where kind of training, or where kind of the actual physical capacity, right? Of the performer, where all this kind of figures, right? In this kind of films. But I do think that it's always like a pendulum, right? So when things go far too when things don't go too much, right, to one side, right, it always try to kind of swing back, to the other side, right? And this happens, to Hong Kong cinema, in the, for example, in the first decade of the 21st century, right? When again, when you have a lot of CGI martial art films, right? But then suddenly, people realize that okay, we should go back to the basics, right? We should go back, to the hard body, right? So that's why you see Donnie Yen, right? Who becomes suddenly become very popular, right? In Hong Kong as well as in other parts of the world. So Ip Man, for example, the whole Ip Man series, it's based on the idea that let's move away, right? From CGI action, right? And focuses more on the hard body, of the performer.
It certainly worked. Probably a vast majority of the students know what you're talking about now. They're like, yes, some films I'm familiar with, instead of this old 1960s stuff, which is really excellent film in its own right. But Paul Godchild, or Goodchild, I'm sorry.
Yes, hello, I'm here.
I can hear you. Question.
Great. Yeah, I have a question. First of all, thank you, Dr. Yip, for your presentation and talk today. I've found it very informative, and thank you, Professors Corey and Hasty, for facilitating. My question deviates a little bit from the world of film and into the world of business. You did mention capitalism, and as a business professional in the modern capitalistic world, I've been told to work harder, not smarter, or sorry, work smarter, not harder, to a minimum viable product, and to fail fast. And this seems to stand in direct contrast to the ethos of the dedicated labor and training required in the master-student succession. So my question is, which components or narratives of martial arts philosophy would today's business leaders do well to heed or even adhere to?
Well, I mean, this is a very good question, right? And I think you made an absolutely kind of valid point about how this kind of dedication to effort, right? This dedication to labor, right? Is there still a role, right? For it, right? In today's society. But one thing I do want to mention is that in my presentation, I was focusing mostly on the 60s and 70s, right? And it was a period of industrialization in Hong Kong, right? And again, the economic context, right, of 60s and 70s Hong Kong, right, is very different, right, from what we witness, nowadays, right? And back in the days, it's still about the body, right? Doing industrial work, right? So again, physical labor, right? Hard labor, right? Was the main thing, right? In that context, right? And obviously, nowadays, we are shifting increasingly from manual labor, right? To immaterial labor, right? Or kind of, affective labor, right? Or whatever you want to call it, right? And yes, given this context, right, the kind of, training your body, right, or being more hardworking, or, exerting more effort, right? Yes, I mean, those could seem, outdated ideas. We are living, in a different kind of, different kind of modernity, right? Instead of, industrial modernity, we are essentially living in a kind of a post-industrial informational society, right? So that's one. There's a reason why we see an increasing shift, right? From martial art films, that focus, on the body, right? That focus on effort, to martial art films, that increasingly focus on the, the sensation of, special effects, right? Again, they are still sensational, right? They still kind of, eye-catching, right? But at the same time, you don't quite feel the effort, right? You don't quite feel, the heaviness, right? Of the action itself, right? Because everything just, flash by, right? And then, you don't really feel the need to exert, right, effort, right? In performing the action, right? Because in many ways, the effort, or the sensation, is within the special effects, themselves, right? Rather than located, in within the body of the performer. So in this sense, yes, I mean, you're absolutely right in kind of observing this kind of transition, right? Or even transformation of society. I don't know if I answer your question, but this is I guess what I want to point out.
Yeah, thank you for your response.
And thank you for your question, Paul. We do have a related question from Thomas, Thomas Spellmans. Hello, my name is Thomas. With animated films becoming more popular in film, do you believe martial arts films will adopt animation, or would that ruin the idea of authenticity?
Well, I mean, it's interesting that, some people would argue that, movies with a lot of, special effects, right? Movies, with a lot of CGIs, they should be called animation rather than, live action film, right? And I think there's a point to this, right? Because, with CGIs, basically, what is important, is not, the live action part, right? It's not the shooting stage, right? But rather, the post-production phase, right? And that is, how you kind of, manipulate the live action footage, through computer software, right? So this is essentially animation, right? Because animation, is also kind of, using your computer, to create, images, from scratch. And we know that, CGIs, can be based on live action footage, but CGIs can also be created entirely from scratch as well, right? So in a way, we are not that far away from animated films, right? Again, animated films, not in the narrow sense of just animation, right? But rather kind of the films that we are watching these days, many of them can actually be called animation.
Yeah, you brought up some excellent examples, Dr. Yip, when you mentioned Kung Fu Hustle and Shaolin Soccer, right? I mean, this is, there is animation in those films as well.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Okay, going on to the next one. My name is Vishwa. This was a very interesting talk. I was wondering, do you think the connections that are seen between Hong Kong movies and Hong Kong's social life can be seen in martial arts movies from other East Asian countries?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm not as familiar with other East Asian action films, right? But obviously, one thing that I do know is that Hong Kong martial art and action films have always been very popular, right? In the regional market, right? In Southeast Asian and in a number of other places, right? Especially again during the period of the 60s and 70s, but also 80s. So I would think that, you know, the same kind of appeal, right, you know, also applies, right, you know, to those, you know, other contexts. Or we can also think about, you know, some kind of, you know, imitations, you know, of Hong Kong action films, right, you know, in places like Thailand or, you know, in Indonesia, right, you know, the Tony Jaa film. So again, you know, a lot of those films, you know, are in a way kind of, you know, imitations, you know, of Jackie Chan, right, you know, and on, you know, action films in Hong Kong from the 80s. So yeah, I mean, in a way, I mean, it's almost like, you know, Hong Kong is used as a kind of a model, right? And for which, you know, other people, I mean, people from, you know, other parts, you know, of, let's say, you know, the Asian region, right, you know, try to imitate.
And that's really interesting because of, like, when I think of the Shaw brothers and the kind of, you know, like reach they had into Southeast Asia, like I'm sure that like there was some influence there from a very early period, from the 60s.
Yes.
Okay, let's get to this next one. So from Jason, for my question, I'm curious about what inspired or led you to studying Hong Kong martial arts films in particular, and how long you've been studying them.
Well, I mean, one thing, you know, I come from Hong Kong, right? So that's, you know, those are films, you know, that I watched, right, you know, as a child, right? And in a way, you know, as a film, you know, professor, I like, you know, all kinds of films, right? You know, obviously, you know, I like, you know, these exciting kind of, you know, martial art films, but, you know, I also like, you know, the more intellectual, more cerebral, you know, art films, right? But it's just, you know, it's just that, you know, I find these films, you know, so interesting, not only as entertainment, but, you know, also as a way, right, you know, to provide insights, right, you know, into the social dynamics, right, you know, of Hong Kong, you know, during that particular period.
So yeah, we have, I think, 2 questions left, and one I'm going to kind of summarize, and I think they're asking, like, out of all the different like training methods that you've mentioned and that you've seen on film, like, in your opinion, are there any specific kind of methods that are more, I guess, effective, that would allow the martial artists to gain their skills at a quicker pace? And do you personally have a favorite? If so, what is it?
Well, it's interesting that, you know, students always ask, right, even though, you know, I mean, obviously, you know, I teach martial art films, right, you know, but students always ask, right, do you also practice, you know, martial arts, you know, yourself, right? And my answer is no. I don't practice, you know, martial arts. And again, you know, it is not even clear, you know, if the training depicted, you know, in martial art films, you know, is really kind of, you know, quote unquote authentic or not, right? Or, you know, it really kind of, you know, serves to train, right? It kind of, you know, it looks good, right? And then, you know, it is kind of, you know, ingeniously kind of, you know, designed, but, you know, it is not clear, right? You know, it is effective at all, right? But one thing I do want to point out is that, you know, as I mentioned in my presentation, at least, you know, in 36th Chamber of Shaolin, right, the emphasis, you know, is very much, you know, placed on the very kind of, you know, basic and fundamental capacities, you know, of the body, right? So so we are talking about, you know, just balance, right, you know, strength, right, you know, and agility, right, rather than, you know, fancy fighting styles, right? And I think I can really kind of, you know, I think, you know, that really speaks to me, right? Because I think, you know, no matter what you do, I think, you know, kind of, you know, building up, you know, your basics, you know, and fundamentals, you know, is important.
And there is another question here on the chat about weapons. And I know that we've discussed the staff in class, but any other, like, and please be brief. I just want to get to Jack for our last question, Dr. Yip. But
okay,
any other weapons that pop out that you know, that are prevalently portrayed in or represented in Hong
well,
Kong?
I mean, there are all kinds of weapons, right, you know, in martial art films, right? You know, as you may, I mean, if you watch more Hong Kong martial art films, right, you know, you will notice that, you know, there are all kinds of weapons, right? And Lau Kar-leung made a film called The Legendary Weapons of China or something like that, right? So again, that film is essentially about, the different kinds of, the different varieties of weapons, right? And some of them are very exotic, right? It's not just blade or, sword or, pole, right? But, some very exotic, weapons.
Yeah, I mean, I think of the Shaw brothers and some of the weapons they
Yeah.
created. I mean, just unbelievable. And they might have even been experimenting with CGI at that time on their weapons. Anyways, Jack, do you have a question to round us out tonight?
Yes, and thank you, Dr. Yip, for your presentation. I just wanted to ask, do you think that the decline of these martial arts, or the decline of the popularity of these martial arts films, do you think it would have been less significant if these films were not severely embedded with these very Western ideas of self-actualization and just like the idea of self in general?
Well, again, I think there are a lot of reasons why, the martial art film genre has declined over the years. Again, there's a sense that, and one thing is actually, the lack of talent, right? Because, you need people like, Jet Li or Donnie Yen, right? People who has the charisma, right? But who also has, the physical skills, right? To make a good martial art film, right? To make a good, kung fu film, right? But right now, we see kind of a certain lack of, this kind of talent, right? And maybe, people are just not interested, right? In spending a lot of time and effort, right, in training themselves, right? Because it does require a lot of dedication and effort, right, and time, right, to become a Jet Li or to become a Donnie Yen. I mean, it's easy, right, to say that, okay, yeah, I mean, Jet Li is so cool, right? Donnie Yen is so cool, but then they spend literally decades, right, in kind of perfecting, right, their bodies, and skills, right? And again, I would think that nowadays, people, just don't have the patience, just don't have the perseverance, right, to go through, all of this.
Okay, everybody, I think that's about all the time we have for tonight. We don't want to keep Dr. Yip around too long. So
Thank you very much.
Maybe you can join me in virtually clapping for Dr. Yip. And thanks so much again for coming and speaking to our class. And thank you also, Professor Hasty, for making this all possible as usual. So really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good discussion.